Okay. Great, me, Dave. This is Ryan.
Hi. Can you just check that before I start speaking? Yeah.
Speak up just a little more. We're having a little hard time hearing you. It's kind of soft. But we have your presentation up with the picture of the gorilla.
Okay.
So,
present. Yeah. Well, apologies for having to do it like this. I was going to do it from home with a proper WebEx environment, but then I had to come to Paris for a meeting. Yeah. That's in the reception area of Ipsos, so deep apologies. Yeah. I will start off with this slide of the gorilla because it's one of the bases how we started to approach the research. It's a phenomenon called intentional blindness, and I won't bother to read the slides. You can do that for yourself. But just to immediately step into projects we're doing in Africa at the moment, and this is a technique called scalable ethnography. We've got girls who've been subject to genital mutilation and rape, and acting as ethnographers into their own community. In narratives from those communities, I'll talk about how we do that in a minute. And the key thing is the narratives are self-interpreted at the point of judging by the respondent, not actually by the expert. So we did several of those projects with Girl Hubs. We took some of that data and presented it to experts in Washington, The Hague, and London, and got them to interpret stories. Now, the thing is, if you look at the way the girls interpret their own stories, they're highly descriptive. Their space is open to them. Whereas if you look at the way the experts interpret the story, even from three different cultures, they coalesce effectively on interventionist type solution and to avoid description and focus on intervention. Now, that is an illustration because what we're trying to do understand in development sector, economics, safety, and number of matters is to people that own their own descriptions rather than have a description of humans on experts. Now, the principle of that is a thing called human metadata. On to the next slide, which is called scalable ethnography. There are certain basic assumptions, and if you just ignore the picture on the right for a minute, it would normally be a build-up. Yeah? First of all, we know from a whole body of research that the thing which dictates how people see the world are particularly not just their own attitudes and beliefs, that's present, but it's also the attitudes of those around them told through narrative, or for that matter, their own stories, their own views of the world. So stories of the water cooler, the village well, the school gate, which determine how people behave. Yeah? So if you want to capture those micro-narratives, or increasingly these days I'm calling them micro-observations or small noticings. Yeah? We capture them in any form. So in Africa, we're getting people effectively to draw with their fingers on an iPad, and, or to speak, or to write, or to take a photograph, or use an existing photograph. So when people make sense of the world, it's not confined to transcripts, oral transcripts, or just written material. I also know from our own research that the stories that people tell, these experts don't get them right. If the story is just the starting point of meaning for the respondent, if you look to them to interpret their own story, they effectively add layers of meaning to that original material. And the whole body of problems with conventional research, whether it's interview-based or questionnaire-based, that people either gift or gain the results, or you have a problem of asking direct questions. So that be developed and patented is the use of triads. You can see a decision triad. And the point about a triad is it has 3 positive or 3 negative labels. So, for example, in employee satisfaction, my favorite case, instead of says your manager employ you on a regular basis, 0 not at all, 10 all the time, or average your experience over many managers in the year, go to, say, 5% of the copy every week and say, what's the story you would tell your best friend to get off the job in your work unit? To interpret it onto 6 triads. One of those triads has, in this story, the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, or analytical. As it engages a novelty receptive part of the brain, people can't answer it in automatic pilot. They have to think more deeply, and it's kind of like a form of game. So kids in Africa, they're telling a story, then we have 6 triangles based on exactly what a longitudinal research would have as a series of fields, transposed into triangles. And people themselves interpret their own story. They work, for the moment, for example, on patient journeys, but effectively keep continuous narrative and interpret those stories onto structures around care or pain. So effectively the patient now becomes a subject, not an object within the process. No? Concept, because it allows us to do some radically different things. Now, we're off in the slides which I should have sent you, so apologies for that, I'll send you this later. Is to handle very large volumes of data at very low cost, which is why the British Home Office called it ethnography. The people that own ethnographers into their own communities, we have to draw sophisticated landscape maps, actually representing hundreds of thousands of stories. And that's some marks. But critics can also see the outliers, because outliers are where threat and opportunity come. So research methods which eliminate outliers, or which focus on questionnaires or focus on questioning, you actually not see weak signals or weak opportunities. The other part of this approach is that you're carrying your intervention method with the research method. So people can pick up on their iPad as they tell their stories, they can click over, they can see distribution of stories over a triad, and you can see that in this particular model here. Yeah? Each of the dots represents a different story from a different ethnic group. So then you can swing the finger around those stories and read the stories directly. So if you make an intervention, you don't say, let's take a Mexico counter-narco project, for example. How do we create a culture of legality? With a landscape model and say, how would we create, or what would we do to create more stories like this and stories like that? Stories like this, fewer stories like that, is a key intervention method because to engage people, even illiterate people, in their own solution, as well as engaging experts within the same cognitive framework. That's like a key principle. On slide 5, that's to actually show you the landscapes. There's a map capture in the Middle East. Effectively, the white grid presents, I think on the left-hand side, 17,000 stories. On the right side, 28,000. Dots represent live project, live event. So across in time, these are actually scoped every 3 months. You'll see the story, the small pattern of 8 stories clusters in the right-hand model. And that's 8,000 stories, 8 stories out of 28,000 represent a potential intervention point. That gives us continuous real-time monitoring rather than a linear process of designing solutions. Again, a key aspect of this approach, together with mass engagement. Now, I do the other slide, because it's without seeing an audience to get feedback. But the principle here, I'll just give you a couple of 2 or 3 other projects we're working on at the moment to give an example. In Dubai, early this week, and we were defining a project by which women who are actually going back to work who need childcare will effectively keep continuous journals throughout their journey into work, back from work, picking up their children, using their children. To actually have a research base to understand what's actually causing them to be prepared to work. But then creating 2 other projects, such as the data capture. One, to understand how we set attitude to being a professional child carer and kind of like a servant to being a professional. But we make the effectiveness of the public transport, which is being funded by the state to move people to the environment. And that's an interesting project. That's another project where we're working with the Colombian government on the FARC peace negotiation. A database of stories from around the world of things which have worked or not worked be interpreted as the point of origin by the people who remember them, but then negotiate them with current problems the negotiators are facing, both in the negotiation and with getting the people to accept it referendum. It's called acceptation or serendipity. Well, it creates solutions with problems on a horizontal basis. And, that's to avoid effective deviation, misinterpretation, but to allow very fast, real-time feedback. With NDP, we did work in Eastern Europe. We got Roma kids to actually feel their contribution to Roma communities. We got the people had never ever got before. Working in Bangladesh, we show that expert assessment now is interpreted things negatively, and actually the people themselves saw it as positive. In Ghana, we did a fascinating project that showed that it was nothing to do with poverty, whether people prefer clean water. It was due to relative wealth and proximity of other people that had done it. I give an illustration, but the major points about this is it's a new method. Monitoring becomes evaluation. Typically, I can share outcome, not output. These are the direction in which stories are being switched by different initiatives. Again, I'll give a non-development example on that. In the UK, when teachers who inspire kids to learn actually don't get rewarded, people out learning plans actually get rewarded. So now we're starting in Welsh schools by which children will keep continuous diaries of their life experience. That will measure the impact of teachers, but also to measure the impact of social work, measure the impact of sport, and a whole body of other areas. People don't live their lives in the neat silos of research. They live their lives as a whole. And it's given them the ability to represent lives or frameworks and to people with power. So that summary, without any audience response, because I'm speaking through a phone, so I apologize if I got it completely wrong. But down like what we're doing, I'm more than open to any questions, or even got odd arguments if anybody wants one.
The questions I have, Dave, and what's fascinated me about the work that you're doing is environments are chaotic data. If we were to do household survey data and collect 80 variables, you have chaotic data in these situations. Yeah. And then use narratives, as you call them, or short stories to one of those situations more comprehensively without adding more data points. Is that
we're actually increasing the number of, increasing the number of data points, but we're allowing people to interpret stuff into high abstraction data. So we're dealing with the dispositions of a system and the attitudes of a system. We're actually saying there is no causality in a human system. But dispositions and attitudes, and that's therefore what you measure, and that's what we can do. Has this intervention improved the dispositions of the system towards that outcome? Rather than how do we measure a sort of cause linear pattern?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. People online that I'm going to check to see if they have questions as well. So if you're online and you're not hooked to a microphone, if you want to type a question, I can relay the question as well if you put it into the chat function. Does anyone have a question? You may have to speak up. I think he's hearing through that.
So I have a question on sampling and literacy levels. How do you decide to participate? Affect what you get in the end, and then as well as the difference in literacy people that are.
Good question. I can't hear it.
You want to come back? I have a microphone here on the computer.
Can you hear?
Here.
Yeah.
So I had a question about sampling and literacy levels. So how do you decide who participate in the population, and also does the literacy level affect what the outcome you get in the end?
there's no difference in sampling on this sort of method than any other method. The advantage that we can, because we can our own ethnographers, we can get people to sample into their own communities. So for the moment, we're taking all 14-year-olds in Welsh schools in 3 areas and giving them criteria to go and pick people and interview them. Yeah? Capture demographics as goes, so with a large database, we can then pick samples from that database. So just as in any research, you try and go as broadly as possible. The difference, because there's an incremental cost and additional capture, we can go to the large volume very quickly. One project we're currently having conversations about funding with major companies is to actually use technology into a representative sample of schools in every country in the world. Creators and journalists will capture stories every month about their community. Now, the other on that is to create a whole new research database for you to develop better. Really creating citizens as a field mechanism, and that will give us a really huge sample. But we need some proper funding to do that, which we're talking about. This is very similar, but we can scale faster to numbers, which actually means it's easier to sort out sample data as well.
Is that a question? Talk to the literacy issue in terms of how it might impact on it.
Yeah, we actually done projects with people who can be illiterate because they can draw pictures or speak, and we use symbols instead of words for the index. We're not fussed about what language people tell the stories in because we're doing exploration for the statistics. Which reduces cognitive bias by the observer. So we captured stuff using symbol labels only. I mean, in Mexico, we took symbols from their history and abstracted them. And then literally told stories and moved the symbols around to say what their story meant. Yeah? We've actually managed to move into illiterate communities in a way that nobody's managed before.
A question from someone during the webinar. Who plots the responses in the triangle area? And does the result have some bias, and how mitigated?
Well, response is always biased. What we do is we take theory in the field to construct the triad. So a lot of researcher has a theory of the field when they tag the narrative. We take that theory, but we allow people to self-tag their own material. Secondly, we can randomize which label appears on which corner of the triad by entry. The research says neither the position nor the color makes any difference. But if people end about, we simply randomize where the triad label appears on each time somebody goes into the system.
The individual participant then is the one who puts where it is on the triangle, or is it some read story to?
That's critical. But we've transferred the power of interpretation to the research subject and away from the expert. The power to tell their own story, we've given them the power to interpret their own story, and that's really important.
So what's the story then? You use it on the triangle.
So at any stage, if I see the landscape maps I showed with the all the dots on the triangle, I sweep my finger around that and I can read or listen to the story if I've been granted permission to see them. We did 10 years of work with Australian Aboriginals on child abuse, where those stories were withheld, but the fact that shared their interpretation gave us all the data we needed.
Okay.
I have a couple of papers I can send you, which describe the actual, the academic side of it in more detail if people want that.
Yeah, and I can post them to the website where we'll have the recording of this video as well.
Cool.
In another question I have. So if you were to use this in a project monitoring type of way, so that you are doing an agriculture project in Nigeria, and you to use it for monitoring howling, how close are you looking at typically for data collection like that?
For example, go to schools or local, local educational groups or the midwife or whoever, and basically give them a tablet in return for capturing stories from the sample on a continuous basis. They'll become fairly cheap androids. We can distribute, a girl has done that, we can distribute those into the community. And then the community effectively gather their own stories, and we can monitor that we're getting the right sample size in. So you don't have to send in experts or anything. People become their own ethnographics with them. It's cheaper to ship some androids in than to ship in a lot of expensive people.
I have this slide up, the one that starts with beyond PROS, PROF, clarity technique.
Sorry?
Can you tell a little bit about that project?
One says, which one?
Bar across the top, beyond PROS, using narrative techniques to understand real life.
Oh, that was chronic pulmonary care. You got patients to keep continuous stories about their days. And these are people on oxygen and morphine permanently. Every time they felt different, they told the story, just index without telling the story. And it actually accounts for 80% of the variation in oxygen uptake by the way they index their stories. So that was adding people's experience to actually more traditional medical data. We're on a B2C management at the moment. And just come back to Zealand talking in the Ministry of Health. So we're going into a B2B management and patient management there to match up against this. And to own their own healthcare is increasingly important. It's very important in indigenous populations where they really get hit by the wrong sort of diet. And lectures about what to do doesn't work. I mean, we've done work on bush tucker in Australia and elsewhere. You've got people the right sort of information and the right sort of ability to report what's happening to them if you're actually going to improve healthcare.
Great. Any questions? Or,
and real-time response settings, for example, when there's a disease event or something you're wanting to take down in real time, people's experiences as they go through the event.
Say again slowly. I didn't pick that one up.
Okay. Have you used this in kind of emergency response events at all, or could you see how it might?
Yes, okay, got it. Yeah, we're now starting to do, and this is the whole point of what we're doing about Children of the World, is deploy this in situation before there's an emergency. So when emergency, we've already got what we call citizen journalists in the field who can act as a properly controlled sample for response, which is different from some of the other approaches, which is using social media. And if you want to do that, it's far too easy to game social media. So in a healthcare crisis, for example, 30% of the tweets may well be generated by algorithms, not by people. Yeah? The increasing body of stuff which means we need to create we create a network for an ordinary purpose, which we create for an extraordinary need, and that will be a big area of development. Yeah? For example, you put androids into schools in order they can capture stories to understand what's working on and impact level. Then they get hit with an earthquake. Well, you immediately activate them to gather data. You don't do a secondary response. You've got a primary responder already there. The thing on this is you move away from the idea of research as a linear mission, actually creating what we call a human sensor network, in which the system is feeding back to you in real time. And coincidence on at the world headquarters of Ipsos today, because in market research that transforms the world. Yeah? It is your real-time research, not commissioned research. And that allows you to respond far faster with small interventions to prove the overall condition. You have small merely based on weak signal detection. On that picture of the white grass, the ability to spot a point where a very small intervention very fast would make a big difference is key, really, to sustainability in the world. Any more?
Check online too. Does anyone online who's joined us have questions that they would like to ask? You can do the chat area on the right-hand side of the web.
Lauren, Ryan, can I ask a question?
Dave, you hear Lauren?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm joining by telephone, so I cannot see the PowerPoint, and I haven't been able to hear everything. It's come through partly garbled, so excuse me if I've missed something that you've already said. But I'm just curious. Basically, as you say, this is an approach that's different from a more traditional kind of linear research approach. And so, just as you would say that a linear approach will miss certain very important elements that this approach will reveal, I'm interested to hear from you what the opposite of that is. What do people who do linear research fear or say to you that is missing from this approach?
Generally, that they're not as involved as they normally are, if I'm being cynical.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
I mean, qualitative researchers want to have them taken out and burned alive. Yeah, quality people get it more. I think the issue is how do you do the hypothesis creation? And we say, well, yeah, you can do hypothesis research, that's valuable, don't stop it. But non-hypothesis or objective research. Yeah, then you might move a more traditional linear process in to look at something very specific revealed by the landscapes. So either or it's a both down. The phrase I just gave you is key. This is non-hypothesis based.
Right.
Yeah? So it opens up more possibilities.
And how do you then, again, I haven't, I'm not looking at your angle or whatever, but how, I guess this gets back to the question that was asked about sample size or whatever. Using are you basing the action on obviously on what comes out of the series? And
you can engage more people. That's the more stories like this, fewer stories like that. But you also get traditional correlations. So we export to statistical packages. We could see, for example, in Ghana, a strong correlation between proximity to clean water and relative wealth, and a zero correlation, except indirectly, with a poverty index. Yeah? We can do the sort of traditional statistical stuff on the picture as well. But on the prevention side, the ability to engage is key. More stories like this, fewer stories like that. Not a single story. This is the big difference with things like most significant change. Over focuses on a single story too quickly. We look at patterns in multiple real-time stories.
Right.
So in Mexico, we have people outside the churches gathering the stories that Mary of Guadalupe would say to people in Mexico today. from that, we could go to people of goodwill and say, how would we create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? We did, how would we create a culture of legality? That doesn't engage people. It engages experts.
Right. Okay. You just have to ask the initial question to get people to tell the story. So the question you ask.
Do, or if you get people to journal, or you make people citizen journalists. So, for example, we pulled in 80,000 in a couple of weeks in Pakistan through the British Council, children to go into their communities. We said, find the person in your grandparents, your parents, your own generation you most respect. A story about their lives they think you should remember for all time.
Right.
Yeah? That was huge, all right? And that gave us, we've repeated that project in Libya, in Syria, in Iran even, all right? In Glasgow, that is a hugely valuable data about underlying attitude.
Sending these stories for
Radicalization, we actually proved that radicalization goes from the UK to Pakistan, the other way around.
Yeah. Say that again, I'm sorry.
Radicalization goes from the UK to Pakistan, not the other way around.
Okay.
Yeah. And what was interesting is that was an open source database. The kids continue to use it for learning.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we're wanting them to own their own culture again. They can tell us what their culture is. Have some external anthropologists going to tell them what it is. They own their own interpretation. It's really important.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Jen.
If you just because the sound is not that clear, and I think a really important point. How do you get from the stories to the triads? Can you again?
Well, at the end of the thing, I've given you 2 codes where you can download. So you can download an app, and then the analysis only works on an iPad. So people tell a story or speak a story, draw a story, and then we present the triads to them, and they move their fingers around on the triads till they're comfortable with the placement. Person who says where their story fits on the triad. It's not interpretive algorithm or by network. It's the person who tells the story.
So we kind of...
So the project I've given you, one is a generic capture, it's not development. I've also given you the one we did in Colombia to understand attitudes to entrepreneurial behavior, where we've got stories over 6 cities, continuous basis, and you've got the data set for measuring, which you can have that on an iPad.
Also post copies of these slides for everyone. Question from Sarah online. So use the sense maker. Do we use the software from the get-go to record responses? In other words, if we already have collected qualitative data via interviews or surveys, can we actively analyze that data or not?
Yeah, we've done that. So, for example, if we get a set of data, say, interpreted by, a group of people, we can replicate the interpretation on existing material. Well, that's effectively a training data set. But that's more expensive. Or we can represent the data for interpretation by different people. Our approach is, we can replicate how a group of people would have indexed material in machine learning. Not as we get them to tell the stories in the first place, but it allows us to go through legacy databases and the system very quickly.
And so a similar follow-up question is from David. What technology, software, and methods do you use to analyze the stories on a surface high-value information, identify non-obvious associations, or reveal patterns?
Can do that. There's loads of software packages. We focus on letting people interpret their own stories rather than algorithms interpret the text. But you can do that. I will say when we compare the way that machine algorithms interpret together with the way that people interpret stories, the correspondence, and we find that stories which machine algorithms start as irrelevant and actually very relevant to people who index them. But I indicate caution there that use both tools and look at differences. Key for that is people interpret their own stories, not machines, and not experts.
And probably explain this, but it's hard to hear. I understand how software happens without you entering variables to the content of the story. The part I'm confused about is...
Because you're looking at patterns. Just on the complexity side, you're looking at patterns. You're not dealing with the causal system. So if I see a correlation starts to emerge, I click on the correlation and I can read 15 or 16 stories associated with that correlation. That's how things are moving. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And the validity comes from the volume of capital. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear.
It's just similarity to dissimilarity between. So I think it's like a analysis of the signifiers.
Yeah.
And then you're creating essentially a matrix between the signifiers and the triad. And you don't need words for that because it's essentially creating.
We can use your symbols, or we can use drawings, yeah.
And that.
We're doing much more work on symbology at the moment.
So you can use that to also do classes of the different constructs.
So I'm understanding it correctly. From the story to the data, but from the data to the story.
Yeah.
Putting things in the data, then you go back to the story
To figure out what the story's saying.
rather than trying to interpret.
And that reduces bias. Perfect, you've got it.
And
That's that.
okay, so can I ask him a little bit?
Come over and
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, because this is my.
Sitting here
I think I figured out how to do it.
So my
I'm not
question
hearing any of it.
okay, so one of the I think during the early part of the presentation, one of the things that I missed was to talk a little bit more about the creation of the signifiers that are admitted to analysis.
Okay, there's paper on the website you can download by Beth Miron, right? What we did with the cultural set we used in Pakistan and Libya is when the field of cultural anthropology, we extracted the core concepts on that, working with a team of 14 anthropologists, actually made those concepts into triads. We've done the same with safety, with patient safety, economic advantage in Colombia. So the concepts that the longitudinal researcher has in their mind, we take those, so we've got a research authentication, but then transfer them into the triad, and then people self-interpret rather than the experts. Look at the paper from Beth Miron, you actually see all the references and the academic authentication is triad.
Okay.
You've got to put some structure in place, otherwise people are just grunting. Yeah? So if you draw stories, then either an expert or an algorithm interprets it, and if it's meaningless or only partially meaningful. We have what's called an enabling constraint in complexity terms, where a high abstraction label as a sort of word, and that is meaning to emerge between researcher and a research subject.
Good. Yeah.
In a typical research project, how many triads would you show somebody when you're asking them, when you're working with somebody in the triad?
We can keep it to 6, and the cognitive limits beyond which people get bored, and so we try and keep it to 6, which you can do without too much difficulty, because the paradox is high abstraction produces more precision. The man makes the signifiers very precise, so that's the less valuable data you get. And it's from human language. Human language is metaphor abstraction-based, not concrete labeling-based. One of the problems with big data and traditional research is it to appreciate the role of abstraction in human meaning. It's symbolic art came before language in human evolution. So you're working with abstract art than you are with precise terms.
So how big are the stories that people tell? Are they like Twitter stories or are
Guys, one or two graphs, one or two paragraphs. They're micro stories. Very few people tell grand stories unless you have a workshop with people facilitating it. Then they tell stories, and they tell stories in the other meaning of the word. Yeah, these are fragmented observations of their day-to-day life or pictures. Huge value by asking people to tell pictures, not tell stories. Then in pictures. Yeah, what makes this a good place to live? Take a picture, index it.
Yeah. There's a group that does monitoring and evaluation work in India that's using a lot of that too. Again, tell your story, but also to get over the literacy issue because they can picture, but they might not be able to put words to the situation.
Got it. And we add the statistical interpretation to that, so we allow it to scale in much larger volume much faster.
Questions?
Oh,
For people that touch it, so. We did
questions, just email, and I'll happily send the material around to them. Yeah.
Okay. We did one comment that I should mention from someone online that says, very insightful, and they're glad you mentioned that a lot of Twitter activity is bot-generated and non-organic. Isn't that
tell more people about that? There's lots of research on it.
Okay.
And pharma companies are employing teams of people to do it. Any explicit will always be gained. It's just human life. That picture is too explicit. Anything which an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm can generate.
Okay.
Can I head off the garden?
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Have a good trip to Paris.
Great, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Dave.